Ladies and gentlemen, as Brigadier Peischl said, we now have a distinguished expert and a special guest whom we can welcome here in the framework of the Strategy Conference. Professor Münkler is known to all of you. His work goes back decades and has always marked this discourse, and I believe that it is not an insult if I say that he's a one-man think tank. He really knows about war, peace, social and political issues, and he really thinks about these things in a very profound way. He is somebody who is between politics, science, philosophy. He knows what he's speaking about. He thinks about it. So sometimes people know what they speak about, but they can't think about it. And conversely, but he himself, he can do both, think and know. And quite apart from the fact that his thinking is so profound, and he's also found the access to power in a very specific form. On the one hand, he has found access to the media. He is really in high demand in Germany when it comes to such political issues, but also he has found the way to politicians themselves. So people, well, maybe talk to the media, but apart from the media, nobody listens to him. And then there's people who are advisors of politicians, but don't talk to the media. And Professor Münkler does both. So he gives advice to politicians. He marks the also discussion in the media. And that's a very specific and special combination. And this is why we're so pleased to have him here, because his words carry weight due to the strategic position in this discourse. But for our little polymological working group, this is important that he's a polymologist. So he's somebody who thinks through war, tries to understand it, analyzes its structure with the intention to neither have to wage it nor experience it. So it is possible, ladies and gentlemen, to think about war without adoring it. It needs to be analyzed, broken down, understood, and only then can you understand to start becoming engaged in politics, peace politics, maybe defense and security politics. But anyway, what's decisive is that you need to understand its principles, its nature. That applies to all spheres of life, but of course war is a bloody business, and if you don't know what you're talking about, then things get really dangerous for everybody concerned. The subject of tonight's lecture also deals with polymology, the chameleon of war. As Clausewitz said, this chameleon does not only change its shape, its exterior, and whenever there's an opportunity to change, but maybe it also changes its nature. Does it? That's a question. Does it change its nature? This binarity, this binary order that no longer exists, since the borders are increasingly blurred, has it really changed its nature, or does this chameleon change even more now in terms of its very nature? Why do we have rules of war? It may sound like a paradox, because this was a way to, well, contain it legally. That was also Cicero's intent. Certain rights were prescribed at the beginning of war, so that everybody knows that now the war has come, and the same applies at the end of war for peace. There's also rituals. And Cicero was the one who, the first to think up the concept of a just war. He says that only a war that is contained by law, in terms of who, why, and how. This is an idea picked up later by Grotius. So only if the war is constrained and kept within those boundaries and limits can it somehow be survived in a humane way. Now we are faced with a situation where these strict boundaries are no longer given. Everything flows, everything goes, or as Fendrich said, nichts ist fix, nothing is fixed, so everything flows. In Greek, it's aperon. And as the border has been torn down, and very few people understand that the borders actually unite what they separate. But most people, well, they're always surprised that when all the borders are eliminated, they are lost. So, and to quote Hobbes, bellum omnia contra omnes, a war of everybody against everyone, and it seems to be the case that this war might turn into a latent, permanent conflict that might establish itself in our societies in this globalized world. So the global civil war and the global economic zone. So Mr. Münkler will be sharing with us some deep, profound, stimulating and provocative theses, and I'm sure that we're going to have an interesting and enlightening presentation. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for coming. I would like to wish us a very interesting hour of thinking about war and strategy. I apologize. I will have to also take off my jacket. In preparing for this presentation, I stumbled across the will to engage in strategic thinking. And in the first part of my presentation, I will talk about this. And you have talked about the fact that maybe this could also be discussed at the philosophical level. It is, of course, not quite easy to focus first and foremost on the will, because a philosopher who has dealt with the will a lot, Arthur Schopenhauer, so it is an unreasonable will that needs to be contained and actually eliminated. So I guess that wasn't the intention of the organizers who found this title, that the will is what needs to be overcome. On the contrary, the will to strategy is something that seems to be or have to be brought to the fore in light of what our societies now tend to think. Because in the following I will be talking about strategic thinking and not strategy. So we tend to, to avoid strategic thinking or put it on the back burner and not really engage so much in strategic thinking. And in European societies, especially in German-speaking countries, that is a bit problematic and charged, because there's the notorious suspicion of permanently exceeding one's limitations, borders or boundaries. And this is why strategic thinking is something like a troublemaker. Exceeding boundaries to leave the order of law, and on this basis the are administered that way. So crossing boundaries in the sphere of morality, where the intentionality of action, so the question of good intentions, counts more than effect and results. So strategic thinking is opposed to those two predominant forms of how we deal with problems in our society. So the proceduralization and technical solutions and the intentionalization of action and acting. And this makes strategic thinking an outsider, for which you have to justify if you engage in strategic thinking, at least in politics. In business is maybe a bit different, but in politics, strategic thinking is something that requires justification. Now, why, you might ask? Is strategy opposed in terms of our process of how to deal with problems, procedurality and intentionality? I believe that there are two elements that can be considered as contingency and interference, so the factor of chance and feedback effects to a high extent. We could also call it learning processes. So we have an unplannable form of uncertainty and a confrontation with an opposite will, which not only wants something other than I do, but this other will also observes what I'm doing, analyzes it, and draws conclusions from my actions, and then takes counteraction. So I am now engaged in a process of where I'm forced to learn permanently. What this means is that strategic thinking cannot be defined that way, because if you make a definition and make a determination, and if the other side has found you out in terms of how you put this into procedures and in which way you allow some intentions and disallow others, then you're of course at a disadvantage, notoriously so. That means you need flexibility in your reaction patterns, you need the potentiality of keeping on learning, and fixed procedures and intentional standards can thus not be used. Or let's put it differently, let's bring it to a point. Procedures and standards of good and correct action will have actually the effect of being a blockade when we're talking about strategic thinking. The consequence is that strategic thinking is of course not in line with the fundamental structures of our socio-political world. It's in conflict with those structures. It's an outsider. So, under the conditions of binarity, that of the binary order, well, this isn't dramatic, because then you could say that it's a matter for specialists. In the broader sense, in a functionally differentiated society, it is up to specialists who know their business, more or less. Yes, this is one such place where specialists are being educated and trained, and they deal with the exceptions to the rule, and at the same time they assume, since 1945, that these exceptions will never materialize or occur. So those were the constellations under which, even back then at the time of the East-West conflict, strategic thinking could be practiced, but in principle the rest of society had no truck with that. They didn't want to have anything to do with that very much, and it was calming if these individual moves of chess were not communicated to the public, because this might have created an irritating nervousness in our societies. So we could say that since that phase is over, we are now in a nirvana-like state, and we no longer have to deal with that. Many people tend to believe that, but my thesis is that strategic thinking has become even more difficult and more complex, because it is required, but is no longer delegated to specialists who work in a niche. And this has something to do with the diffuse challenges that we're faced with. Let me illustrate this with the help of 3 points, what I mean by this diffuse and decentralized challenges under the symmetric constellations. So both sides had certain capabilities and deficits. You could see where you were superior to the other side. So I still remember we had tanks, submarines, so the blue and the red, and these representations were the icons of symmetry. In those times, security strategies were based on structured planning exercises, and we could assume that both sides in the final analysis would have a symmetrical learning process. So you could learn, and learning could be organized as a process, like in a company. And this is expressed in the wording of the Americans, lesson learned. So as a university teacher, with more than 30 years of working as a professor, I have my doubts whether that is actually true, because what I have observed is that learning is a process, but doesn't say whether the right things have been learned. And I read a lot of papers of my students and have found that occasionally people learn the wrong thing. And as soon as the symmetries no longer exist, the risk of learning the wrong thing is much bigger. Then under symmetrical conditions where you can observe the other side, and if they learn the wrong thing, we will also learn the wrong thing. So that sort of evens out. So on the other hand, it is also part of asymmetrical confrontations that strategies and strategic thinking is no longer a matter of experts and specialists who do this in the various centers, but it is a kind of thinking and considering challenges and problems that the entire society needs to face, or that society needs to be acquainted with. And if it isn't acquainted, then there will be security deficits and problems. So I don't really need to go into detail here, but I believe that when you talk about terrorist threats and the emotional reactions of those who are under attack, it becomes clear that societies that fail to deal with these questions have a higher level of vulnerability than societies that have a good idea of how such challenges can work. So the complexity of challenges has been increased due to the fact that there's now an erosion of the order, the binary order, and I will explain this and I will explain what I mean. And the end of a binary order has led to changes in the imperatives of strategic thinking, and the dimension and the consequences are now only slowly beginning to emerge, and I will try to share with you a few comments in terms of that. The binary order is a principle of creating order that is based on either or, and the tertium non datur, the third thing, is excluded, so it's either one or the other thing. That makes things easy to understand. But binarity is something which cannot be found in the world of politics. This is something that is interpreted or implemented even against resistance at the level of politics. So we need a consensus of all relevant stakeholders that they all use this binary order as a sense of orientation. At the same time, the political world and the strategic games should be coded accordingly. So this is the terminology how we would normally put it today. So either war or peace. And there is no third state. Or this means within or outside, so civil war or war between nations, and there is no third option. So in the Western states based on constitutions, there are ministries, secret services, foreign and domestic. This differentiates clearly between outside or within the country, and either combatant or non-combatant, and there is no third option. That makes the relationships easier to understand and enables you to take decisions, or at least it facilitates decision-making processes that are either referred to as being right or wrong in the normative sense and also in terms of their results. And at the same time, this creates a space for juridification of chaos, of war, that is to say. War and peace, and there is no third. In 1625, the book of Hugo Grotius was published with the wonderful title, 3 Books About the Law of War and Peace. So Grotius, in this book, portrays war and peace as 2 aggregates of this political conflict, and at the same time is saying that law is not only a matter of peace but also of war. And by doing so, he creates the possibility of also separating these 2 conditions of states, or to juridify the transitions as a declaration of war or the conclusion of peace. And when dealing with the 30-year war, this is indeed a revolutionary and quite innovative approach, because most of the acts of war in the 30-year war happened without a declaration of war. The emperor, the Kaiser, Ferdinand II, is based here in Vienna, and he has no reason to, speak out a declaration of war against his rebellious subjects. And they are not waging war against the Kaiser because they are arguing that they are just putting up a fair resistance against an unfair rule. So this is the problem of an order which is not based on this duality or binary order of Grotius, and which therefore also has consequences that I will come back to.
Now, first of all, the precondition of enforcing a binary organized political order was characterized in the monopolization of the state order of the ruler. So it was about enforcing a term which Baudin might have, well, not invented, but at least shaped in a considerable way. And this term reshaped the political order in a fundamental way in Europe. So these 2 men have actually defined the term of binarity without ever using it in Europe. An epistemic order, first of all, as regards knowledge, but then also on the basis of the political and practical order, on the basis of action. Baudin said it's the inappealability of decisions. And Connétable de Bourbon is an excellent example of this. He dies in 1527 in the storm on Rome, in the so-called Sacco di Roma. And the Germans and Spanish infantry were storming towards Rome. And he is involved in this because he's in a dispute with French I in France, and he thought he could appeal to Charles V, the emperor, as a superior authority. And Francis V had his own form of seeing this. He saw it as treason, and so the Connétable de Bourbon tried to make sure to get out of France as quickly as possible and seek the protection of the man who had appealed to the Spanish king and actually the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. However, this is just a transitional form, because it was quite normal to appeal to a higher authority, and as long as there's always a higher authority, which is the highest authority that both sides respect, be the Pope, be the Emperor, there was something like as a form of avoiding war as the final form of judgment. So what you do, you turn to the Pope Alexander VI and you ask him, well, who owns the New World? And then Alexander will give his judgment in 93, 94, Tordesillas, you know, the places, and then Spain and France, and just find an agreement on how to share the New World between them. But the very moment the acceptance of this higher authority was no longer there, this concept of order disappears, and you now have the problem of having to legalize or juridify war, because it takes the place of the decision taken by the Pope, by the Emperor in the European Christendom. And the problem was the two of them, between them, were not even of the same mind all the time. Baudin then invents this term as the fundamental term of the political order, following the experience of French civil war. And Grotius writes his book, which was published in 25, following the experience of the 30 Years' War, which just gets underway, and he sees it as a form of unorder or missing order. Let's look at it more closely. We call it a confessional civil war in France, but it's also a war of the aristocrats against the king's family. They don't accept the king's authority anymore. And then, of course, there are continuous Spanish interventions against the French power. So this conflict in the second half of the 16th century is a mix of internal civil war and war between civil forms. So it doesn't really follow the principle of binarity. It's rather the mix of things that are supposed to be distinguished clearly at a later stage. So this missing order, this overlapping of forms and motives of war are all the more clear in the 30 Years' War, which starts as a constitutional conflict when the Bohemian estates throw out the representatives of the king, including a secretary of the castle in Prague, who has a say there, Ferdinand von Schleidenmark, or the estates, both of them. So this question gets ever more tense. It's the beginning of the war, a constitutional conflict. What is the role of the emperor, of the electors? It's a confessional war. It's a war over hegemony, about the question who has a say in Europe. Is it the Habsburg or France, maybe? Which explains why Cardinal Richelieu has been notoriously intervening in this war on the side of the Protestants. Of course, as the cardinal of the Catholic Church, he would just define it as fighting for the French interests. And that's also turning into a conflict over the shifting of borders between states. And that's the problem with this war. All attempts at ending it by finding a peace agreement at one or two of these levels will fail. The peace of Lübeck, the peace of Prague, they all fail. If I had many Saxons here, I'd say that also the peace of Oder failed, but that was a minor event in the war, only lasted for a few days. And that's a secret of those many interesting tales of diplomacy that Maximilian von Trautmannsdorf understood these four levels and then succeeds at Münster to distinguish these four levels, to understand that he has to find a compromise at each and every one of these levels, and all these compromises must be compatible between each other. And this explains why it took so long to negotiate in Münster and Osnabrück, and why Piccolomini, and you'll probably find some pictures of Piccolomini here in Vienna, why in 1648 he's convinced that this peace is never going to actually be observed. It is, finally. And then we'll find a term which is especially used by Anglo-American political scientists, which refer to it as the Westphalian Order, based on the understanding that there should never again be a war which combines all these various forms of war between states, of civil war, of war which cannot be juridified, and so on. So there is this consensus finally that the principle of binarity is actually quite a beneficial principle. If I had brought along a picture, I could have shown them, but of course it would have taken much longer than. It's beneficial because in the second half of this war, the imagination prevailed that war is a beast which devours everything, including the states that have started it. Now one could say that the interest of the sovereign to accept binarity is the interest in turning war into an instrument of politics again, of winning it or of using it as an instrument for themselves. 1.5 centuries later, Clausewitz, of course, defined this as being a continuation of politics by other means, and that's quite accurate if you use the conditions of binarity. If this order is no longer there, then you return to a constellation in which, in the second half of the 30 Years' War, was depicted by artists this beast, this zombie, which was shown in various engravings, the beast that devours everything, destroys everything. Now let me return to my initial question. Strategy is a specialty, or was turned into a specialty of the military, a field of expertise of experts who know what they're dealing with or don't know. And it has to do with enforcing the order of binarity. Now, of course, you could probably say that the 20th century has been marked by an erosion of this binary system and repeated attempts at restoring it. Now, the 19th century, by comparison, was the peak of binarity. In World War I and II, the concept of the total war, as it was called by Ludendorff, these erosive tendencies started by eroding the levels in which binarity can create some sort of order, and these levels increasingly disappeared. Now, we only heard, or I only used positive examples about the Viennese emperors, so let me now turn to the politics of the German General Staff, how they acted against binarity. The second Supreme Chief of Staff explained that the war waged by his predecessor would not work as a war which could be won just like this. It would become a war which would only end by using up all the resources. So they started thinking about how they could change the situation. Of course, their specific considerations may have been different. It's me who describes this in my own terms, but I still think I'm quite right in what I say when I say that their conclusion was that the binary system should be overcome. They said we should use the occasion to play the chance to play the Islamic card, especially against Britain and France. And in 1920, they urged their ally Turkey to declare the holy war, and then, of course, they hoped that there would be insurrections in the French army, in the British colonial army, especially Colmar Goltz, the field marshal who was well acquainted with Turkey. He was in favor of this strategy, and Max von Oppenheim and others agreed. But of course, they were unlucky in a way in that it was 30 years too early. 30 years later, it would have had a considerable effect. At the time, it didn't. But it was the first attempt at dissolving a binary order by introducing civil war elements into wars against states. Second move is the fact that they played the nationalist card, and they didn't want to do it right away because they know that they would hit their own ally, Austria. But then, especially Ludendorff made the conclusion that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not interested that much in the war anyway. They played the nationalist card by supporting Poland, the Irish separatists, and many others. And this had some effect, but not the effect they had been hoping for. Ludendorff actually would have liked to build an army built from Polish soldiers, but of course this never worked out. That's why he's detained in the end. Second card, the nationalist card, or Trump was used against these multinational large empires, especially against Russia in this case. It's a Trump which also attempts to dissolve the binary order, but it doesn't work out. It's the third card that works out well, and that's Lenin. That is to say, providing considerable funds, and as a rule, we're talking about a train going from the Swiss border up to Sassnitz, where it's then continued on a ferry, and it's more than anything millions of marks that are made available to Lenin to increase his propagandistic means. And Lenin then, of course, was grateful by supporting what is called today Sykes-Picot, the breaking up of the pieces of the Near East, and so on. And then finally, Trotsky will have to agree to what is being proposed. So, by introducing elements of civil war, of internal war, into conflicts of states against states, was at least partly successful, and it was then copied by others, and led to a dissolution of this principle of binary order. If you had blamed Ludendorff that this was what he had done, he probably would have said, well, I don't know, we're just waging a total war, aren't we? All the theories of Clausewitz have to be discarded. That's the way he would describe things, in his own words. Now, to a certain extent, you can say what started here in the colonial wars, the guerrilla war, which picked up speed, and then the fact that terrorist actions were no longer just used as a trigger for waging guerrilla war, but as a completely independent form of waging war. All of this led to the fact that the principle of binarity lost its weight. My last point, terrorism, cyber war, drone wars, these are types of the third. Tertio non datur has become an empty formula because the third party is now there in a consistent way, in the sense of an offer, if you will. An offer to the leading politicians of the country which is being attacked in this form, whether to deal with it according to the crime paradigm or the war paradigm, as a war or as a crime they have to act against. In the German autumn in 1977, the government of Chancellor Schmidt, against the opposition of Strauss from Bavaria, would only see the conflict with the Red Army faction on the basis of the crime paradigm. But, of course, then we had 9/11, the Bataclan attacks, so the actions taken as a reaction by the French. In these acts we find the term of war again, so no longer an act of crime which has to be counteracted by police, but as an act of war. Of course, 9/11 is a specific case, but I would go as far as to say that the security feeling of the French and Paris population probably was not reinforced by sending Mirage fighter aircraft into the air or by using aircraft carriers, but probably by the success of the Belgian forces who succeeded in unearthing the Molenbeek cell. So using the terminology of war, of course, was not that influential in the long run, although it reinforced the strong position of the president. Of course, if he had said, well, the police will have to engage investigations and it will take half a year or even longer until we find where they are. That is an example which shows how the system of binarity is being eroded and that political decisions are taken on the basis of opportunities. Where's the opportunity for me? And then you depend on the path chosen. At 9/11, you can see the consequences to this day in Afghanistan. Well, I don't have to enter into any details about cyber war. Also, that's a form of war in which there's a will to make your own will prevail, or something which uses lethal means to make your will prevail. We're trying to use our control and command systems in order to paralyze the opponent. And again, the binary element disappears. Elements of war are introduced in the maintenance of peace. Drone wars, when the United States used drones in areas of Pakistan, Somalia, the likes, they are flying over the territory of countries which are not at war with the United States. On the contrary, Pakistan is an ally of the United States. So, in this case too, this clear distinction, or the certainty of being at war or in peace, is no longer there. Hybrid warfare is the general term, you might say, of all of this. The consequences for strategic thinking, in the sense of making security possible on the basis of the conditions of continuity and interference, have been increased considerably. There's no form of acting against these kinds of threats without including and involving the public. So, handing over or leaving strategic thinking to specialists, groups of experts, who can keep all of it in an arcane system so that your opponent will not know what you're planning, what your options are. That's something that no longer exists. The resilience of a political actor is all the bigger, the more the basic understanding that is given in the general population. It seems quite easy, but actually is a huge challenge to move from this expert-based execution of strategic thinking, and the fact that strategic thinking, strategic actions are no longer limited to groups of experts, but are left to the society at large. And I don't have to take the example of terrorism, drone wars, and the likes. I could just use the current questions about economic ties and the increasing appearance of what could be referred to as an economic war, a financial war. The United States are trying to win against Iran without having to resort to the traditional means of war. It's war in the sense that you want to make your own will prevail over the will of your opponent. There are consequences to this. First of all, in that we have to be skeptical when we think about what constitutes will. We also need skepticism when it comes to subjecting our values to commitments to a values-based form of politics. It seems as though values are no longer a trusted foundation of our actions. At the same time, the Europeans should know, if they act as individual states, as nation states, they don't have any chance of acquiring any form of strategic relevance. They may have a will, but they will not have any strategic competence. They only can have a form of strategic competence if they act in concert, and then of course have a common and unified will. And that's a huge problem, of course, and I don't have any solution for this. I don't think it's the scientists' tasks. Let the politicians take care of that. But of course we can depict the problems that they will have to solve when trying to reach their goals. So strategic thinking as a will prevailing over competing will this does not have to take on the form of a war. He fought with weapons. In the era of binarity, the challenges of this have become way too big, but apart from insisting on the goodwill and trusting that solutions can be found by using procedures, we have to think carefully about what it means to have the possibility to have will and to impose one's will. Thank you very much.
Ja, danke vielmals, Herr Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor MÜNKLER. As I announced, profound thought about the nature of war, conflict, and strategy. And I think we have maybe 15 minutes for discussion. Do you have any questions? Clarification, statements? If not, I will break the ice. You spoke about the blurring of boundaries that the binary order used to give us. Can't we also speak about a democratization of war? Because what was the condition for us keeping to this binary order? That the foundations of power did not emanate from the people, but from the institution of the military. I think we can accept the Clausewitz formula that it's about breaking the opponent's will. But what were the tools to impose one's will? In former times, it was the military that gave you power. And interestingly, in the First and Second World War, we also had the general right to vote. So when this binary order begins to erode on the civilian side of history, we have the general right to vote. And if you want to put this in abstract terms, how do you break the politically relevant will? So my question is, could this have anything to do with that? Yes, of course, it has something to do, but there is a discrepancy between the beginning of the democratization process since 1989 and something that affects continental Europe and the erosion of the order in the 20th century. And if you think about what is the prerequisite for there being a unified will, also in terms of participation of society in these processes. So you would say that nationalism is the crutch that maintains such an order in spite of the process of democratization, so the particularization of the will. And then particularization in this case means a strong influence of centrifugal forces, and nationalism is the centripetal force in this case, by combining emotionality and the readiness to commit a sacrifice for the benefit of a certain project. And this helps us to explain why in the history of the First World War, which was the key war of the 20th century, it is the multinational, multi-denominational and multilingual empires that fall apart, whereas those that refer to nationalism, that can mobilize people for nationalism, have a great ability to enforce their thoughts. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying let's go back to nationalism. Then, of course, we could repair things. No, what I'm saying is that we need an analytical observation to see what functional effects nationalism had for a long time, and when it fell apart, things became much more complicated all of a sudden. And this also explains why there are some states where nationalism is highly attractive, and the political leadership is always instrumentalizing nationalism, because that gives them control. And they escape this task that I have alluded to, namely the ability to engage in strategic thinking in a plural liberal society that can negotiate this freedom or explore it. I think this is an experiment with an uncertain outcome, and I think we could also say that a certain type of terrorism is just trying out to what extent such a plural society is capable of being united over a longer period of time along these lines. So currently we're faced with an interesting experiment. I'm not saying this as a politician, unfortunately I'm not, but I'm a political scientist who is observing and describing these phenomena, and therefore I can say, well, this has the character of an experiment. A couple of hands in the audience. Let me start here and then go around. Professor Münkler, even in a world where the binarity is becoming dissolved or blurred, when it comes to security, we need a compass. Strategic thinking in such a world or in such a scenario has a completely different character. It's process-oriented character that we are describing here. So maybe we should use strategic thinking as a compass in order to control and regulate those processes. I guess that should be done, yes, but before thinking about how this could be done, the first observation I would make is that in light of the specialization in the past was an organization of learning, right? So let's say the regional defense or the National Defense Academy is such an institution where you learn like in a school. And if we oppose this to the other type of networks that is much more spontaneous, more disorderly, where you don't learn according to a textbook, you can see that this is the first confrontation, and I assume that we're not going to meet those challenges if you don't have elements of this spontaneous, non-bureaucratic learning that is also embedded in this formal system of learning. And I could really expound on that by also including the era of moving away from this stringent top-down approach, and where we are now dealing with the autopoietic subsystems that have their own learning structure. And we could also call it a kind of chaotic learning. It's a huge challenge for any institution, such as the military, to enable this and at the same time not to fall into utter chaos. If you want to, for example, constitute a team of hackers, the problem is that you can only get people if you pay enough, more than you would pay a lieutenant or more than you would pay a colonel. But of course, this is diametrically opposed to the traditional way how a military is organized. So an Indian tribe can't have lots of chiefs, and hackers are composed of lots of chiefs. And I know that in Germany we need a lot of consulting agreements, and these consulting agreements are what caused all these problems for Minister von der Leyen, because she tried to react to the challenge that the Federal Court of Auditors did not plan for. So that's exactly the point that you referred to when we talk about the way a state is formally organized, and the state acts as if this could be dealt with on the basis of this binary order and the different specialist ranks, but at the same time they know they need competences and skills that they can't get under these circumstances. Okay, that's a colleague in the back. Right here. How do you see the situation? Please hold the microphone to your mouth. I can't hear you. My hearing is a bit impaired, the speaker said. So how do you assess the situation in a country where the politically relevant will of the people can no longer be assessed or evaluated because it is held hostage by the plural strategic will of militias and rebels alike, where you have a formally recognized sovereign, but his representatives can no longer leave their offices because the militia won't let them, but at the same time the militia doesn't have any discernible political will. So how do you believe that in such a situation of chaos that you described as being a fruitful chaos can be led to a situation of international order that doesn't really have the will to intervene in such a circumstance? Well, Mr. Stadler put it quite nicely. He said that I try to not only provide political advice in the arcane way by going to the Chancellery and discuss one or the other thing with them, but it is not a coincidence that I also talk to the media a lot, because at the same time I also see this as my mandate to also consult society, based on my thesis that resilience in our societies can only be developed, maybe not all, but if there's a relevant majority of the population has something like a sense for strategic thinking. And that means that the politicians are not really expected to react immediately when there's an attack. So this immediate reaction that often leads to doom. I think we need to also afford them some time to think about how to react. I think that's a prerequisite. And under those circumstances, a plural society can have more resilience than a centralized one. This is something that my old friend and partner Machiavelli also, when I wrote a PhD thesis about him in the 70s and 80s, that's what he used to say, Machiavelli. A country that has a unified will is hard to conquer, but once you have conquered, it's easy to dominate it. Now rule it. And a country that has a dispersed will is easy to conquer, but you can't rule it. Now, that is something that appealed to me, and back then I discussed it with my boss time and again, and I believe that you can consider this as an answer to the problem you outline. But that, of course, presupposes that we ourselves, or every one of us, I guess, should say that this is something that the higher-ups should decide. So I think this is something that we then need to deal with. And we need to take ownership and discuss it together. There's another comment. And then two more, and then we have to end. Otherwise, we have a problem with the organization here. So how do you see the situation in the First World War, which was also an economic war? Every war means constraint for the population. And in the First World War, it was a kind of cute civil war, because all of a sudden there were some people who were unreasonable in terms of their strategic and military thinking. So let's say the butcher who made the meat more expensive is the enemy of the people. So the population was split. So is this like a civil war element? Well, I would say that it is pitting two kinds of war against each other, the war of subjugation and the war of destruction. So I believe that this is a notion that was introduced by Delbrück, and what is clashing here is the notion of a war based on the Westphalian order of land-based powers. A fast decision is reached, and in a confrontation with the maritime power, that traditionally has a completely different time horizon. So if you diligently read Thucydides' War on the Peloponnesus, well, he says that let the Spartans come. They are used to fight against men, but they have no idea what it means to fight against money and against the sea. So you could call this the element of time. And this form of putting war in perspective is introduced by the British, because the French, they don't mind fighting somewhere in the north of France or in Belgium. With the Russians, it's a similar thing. In Galicia, that's where we're going to find out what's what. But the British understand this war as an anachronistic war, like Mao Zedong. It's a long war, a drawn-out war, and in this way they act. And later they're going to say it's an indirect approach, but they don't react to the iron fist of the opponent. Of course they have to react, otherwise the French would have collapsed. But they act on the nerves, on the nervous system. But they need time for that. And then they discuss it, and their strategic discussions, Little Hart and others, and they reach the result that it took too long, trying to use the naval blockade at least until 16 and 17. And if we replace this by a strategic war of bombing, a bombing campaign, then maybe we can accelerate matters. And this is where you get to a point where the dissolution of the binary order plays a role. Michael also, in his book, talked about the problem that Bomber Harris thinks about how it is possible to switch off the arms industry and to see that the bomber pilots tend not to attack the centers of armament, because that's where there's a lot of flak, and they hate flying into flak. So, of course, the consequences, you need to, to eliminate the workers, because that is the same as eliminating the armament centers. So Michael Walter is now faced with the problem that the war of the West against Nazi Germany is considered to be a good war. But how can he justify that? And he finds the concept of the semi-combatant. He's saying that the people who work in the arms industry, they are semi-combatants. I'm pleased about this because it's the third party that is being introduced here into the game. And you can see how this theoretical reconstruction also has an impact on the normative level, where a concept of a third party is needed to justify bombing the workers. And Ambassador Eschinger recently admonished that Federal President Gauck had asked in 2014 to take responsibility for this situation. Merkel and Macron, they want to build up a united Europe, and this will needs to be implemented at the political level in spite of all the problems. And in all the talk shows that we see in Germany, where the political advisors are talking about these matters, you get the impression that what you have presented, the structure, is not even in people's minds, and they're not even aware of it. Well, I had the pleasure of discussing this with Ms. Merkel because she was interested in the 30-year war, so she invited me to the Federal Chancellery for a private course lasting 2 hours. We did the same with the entire cabinet, and we all got a dinner, and they had to listen to me for an hour and then had the privilege of discussing with me for 3 hours. And this was about, after some initial ideas about how diffuse the 30-year war was, and my thesis that this will be like the war in the 21st century. The kind of wars that we're going to have is like the 30 years wars. So the question was, what are we going to do if the Federal Republic of Germany is ready to give in to this growing pressure coming from Washington and to move to 2% of GDP? Because the problem that is rarely discussed in this connection is that this is pressure coming from Washington, but a fear of the European partners that all of a sudden the Germans will have the greatest military capabilities in Europe, at least as far as the funding is concerned, or armament. And the post-war order after 54, 55 or 56 consists in the fact that Germany is accepted as an economic power, but not as a military power. All right. This was an interesting discussion. I'm not betraying any secrets. It was about the European aircraft carrier, and this will no longer be German money or German armed forces, but this would be a specific capability. But the experts are saying that they're quite skeptical because it takes a long time for such an aircraft carrier to be built, and who will give have the command. And then the discussion increasingly was about whether we as Europeans need these capabilities in order to secure our political will, and do we need to protect ourselves against spies from abroad? So it's like with Airbus, when we talk about artificial intelligence and digitization. Well, and this is not a secret either when I say that what was astonishing for me was the intellectual in the cabinet who understood this was Peter Altmaier. You couldn't tell by looking at him. You would think it is a butcher's apprentice, but anyway, he had very precise understanding of these problems, and he really understood what this was about. And you can tell by his industrial strategy that is strongly criticized by the medium-sized companies in Germany, because if we as European actors want to play a role, we need to have certain capabilities, and in the area of industrial policy we need to make sure that companies that are strategically relevant for us, such as KUKA, are not bought up by the Chinese, and so on and so forth. But that, as you can see, and recently I gave a presentation on the area of family entrepreneurs, family-owned companies, and of course there was a stiff headwind coming from them, because this is very hard to implement or to enforce. Because if you say that you have this procedural approach, and their dogma is of course the market economy, and they say that the introduction of strategic thinking in the industrial culture would mean that certain principles of competition would apply or would have to be abandoned. For example, the cooperation between Siemens and Alstom in building high-speed trains. That's an end of competition in Europe, and European prices would go up for these products. But that's a prerequisite to have a player that can survive in this global competition. So these problems are discussed at the political level, but the incentives go in different directions. So if you take one step in one direction, at the same time, you take maybe half a step backward, or maybe even 3/4 of a step backward occasionally. And sometimes this can let people despair when it comes to the establishment of European order, because these things can only work if you have the will to come up with a common will. Of course, they're always saying in Sunday speeches they want that, but on Monday people forget about it. Thank you. I have to be brutal. We are 10 minutes behind our time schedule, and this is a good final word. What's missing is the will to have a will, a common will, that is. So thank you very much, Professor MÜNKLER. I would like to thank our speakers and the people in the audience for these very precise questions. We will now have a buffet where some questions can still be dealt with bilaterally, not in an institutional setting, but in a very modern and spontaneous fashion. So thank you very much. And I would like to ask you to go to the buffet, if that's how the organizers thought we should proceed.